Right, we're going to begin a new study tonight in the book of Daniel. We completed our studies through the book of Ezekiel, and so now we're going to begin looking at the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel was, of course, written by the inspiration of God, as all Scripture is, but God used the prophet Daniel to write this particular book. It should become obvious that he is the writer that the Lord used by examining many of the passages of Scripture, but there's actually folks that try to deny that Daniel was actually the writer, but I want to just share with you a few verses. You don't have to turn to each of these, but just verses that should make it clear that Daniel is the writer. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 1 says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel." In verse 15 of that chapter it says, "And it came to pass when I, even I Daniel." In verse 27 of that chapter it says, "And I Daniel fainted and was sick certain days," and it goes on and explains some other things, but it repeats this multiple times as we go through the book of Daniel. And then even in the book of Matthew in chapter 24 and verse 15, it says, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand." And that, of course, is pointing back to what Daniel has written in the book of Daniel concerning that event. And we'll look at that in our studies. But all of these things should make it obvious that Daniel is the writer. If you look at that first chapter in the book of Daniel, we'll begin by reading the first 7 verses. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego." And so in the very first verse that we read here in Daniel chapter 1, we have an event recorded here and mentioned that helps us establish a time frame for what's going on. This event described in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1 took place around 606 BC. I want to give us a little bit of a background concerning that event so that we can get a better understanding of what's going on as we start in to this chapter. But Jehoiakim was a son of Josiah, and Josiah is described over in 2 Kings in chapter 22 and verse 1 and 2 as a king that did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. It describes him beginning there in verse 1 of that 22nd chapter of 2 Kings. Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jedidah, the daughter of Adiah of Boscath. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, and walked in all the way of David his father, and turned not aside to the right hand or to the left. After the death of Josiah, the people of the land anointed Jehoahaz, the youngest son of Josiah, to be king. And in 2 Kings chapter 23, in verse 29 and verse 30, it says, in his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up against the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates, and King Josiah went against him. And he slew him at Megiddo when he had seen him. And his servants carried him in a chariot dead from Megiddo, and brought him to Jerusalem, and buried him in his own sepulchre. And the people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king in his father's stead. And so, according to verse 31 through 34 of this 23rd chapter, Jehoahaz, we learn, was a wicked king. And we find that Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, removed him from the throne after only 3 months of ruling the people. But in verse 31, it says, Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamuel, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father had done. And Pharaoh Necho put him in bands at Riblah, in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem, and put the land a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. And Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the room of Josiah his father, and turned his name to Jehoiakim, and took Jehoahaz away, and he came to Egypt and died there. And so Pharaoh Necho made Jehoahaz's younger brother Jehoiakim the king, and he reigned for 11 years, approximately from 611 BC to 600. And when Jehoiakim was first put on the throne, Jerusalem at that time was under the sovereignty of Egypt. And so Egypt was basically reigning and ruling over them. And in the 3rd year of his reign, Pharaoh Necho decided to take a second expedition against the king of Babylon. But the problem was he lost the battle. And Nebuchadnezzar drove Pharaoh Necho out of Asia. So then that gets us to our text. According to our text in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar then besieged Jerusalem, which only made sense because Jerusalem had previously been under the authority of Egypt, and so now Babylon had ran them off, so now they would take over Jerusalem. And so after Jehoiakim surrendered, once they were surrounded, he was simply just set back on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar. But now Jerusalem was going to be under the sovereignty of Babylon instead of Egypt. And so according to verse 2, Nebuchadnezzar took part of the vessels of God's house in Jerusalem. And you can see it says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Now, you notice the wording of what we see there in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 2. The Lord permitted, the Lord gave these things into his hand. Now, why would God allow such things to happen? Well, because of the wickedness and the idolatry of the people and their wicked king at the time. They were full of idolatry and rebellion against God, and so God is allowing these things to come to pass as a result of that. Now, in verse 3 and verse 4 that we looked at there, and the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And so we look at this and we know that by the order of Nebuchadnezzar, some of King Jehoiakim's seed and some of the princes of the children of Israel were taken captive back to Babylon. And this would probably have been for at least a twofold purpose in the eyes of Nebuchadnezzar, and it was probably a wise move from a political stance, you might say. But if he held very notable Jewish captives in Babylon, it would help ensure the good behavior of the Jews and the loyalty of Jehoiakim to Nebuchadnezzar, because they wouldn't want anything to happen to these individuals because they were notable individuals from notable families and things of that sort. Secondly, if he took these young men and took them in and began to teach them and train them up the way he wanted them, then that would make it much easier to bring them up at a young age the way he wanted them to be, and then utilize them to influence the other Hebrews. And so it was, again, a wise move on his part for what he was trying to accomplish. And so among these captives were Daniel and his three friends, as you can see from what we read there in verse 6. Now you notice that Daniel and his three friends are referred to as children in verse 4. And we say that because in verse 4 it says, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored. And then it goes on and describes what they expect of these individuals. And then by the time we get to verse 6, we find that Daniel and his three friends are a part of that group of children, as it's calling them, that were taken in. Well, the Hebrew word that is translated there, it indicates a boy, a child, or a young man. It has kind of a broad meaning in that sense, but no older than a young man. And so it's common belief that the age range of taking young men into captivity this way was between the ages of 13 and 17. And so Daniel and his companions were probably somewhere around that age range when they were taken in originally to captivity. They were young men. And so this Babylonian captivity and even the taking of these young men captive back to Babylon, all this had been prophesied of by the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 39 in verse 6 and 7. Isaiah chapter 39 and verse 6 and 7, it says, behold, the days come that all that is in thine house, that which is thy father's, have laid up in store until this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, saith the Lord. And of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And that's exactly what we're reading about taking place in our text. And so, again, we see prophecy being declared and then prophecy being fulfilled. And so these young men were taken captive, and they would be nourished for 3 years, according to Daniel chapter 1 and verse 5, at which time they would then be brought before the king. And you notice it says in verse 5, and the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat. And so this was good food. It was the king's food, so to speak, that they were receiving a portion of. So it was the very best of the food within the kingdom. And so in verse 7, the prince of the eunuchs changes the names of Daniel and his friends, as we see there. And Daniel's name was changed to Belteshazzar. Hananiah's name was changed to Shadrach. And Mishael's name was changed to Meshach. And Azariah's name changed to Abednego. And so when we look back at verse 4, it tells us a little bit about these young men. We can get a better understanding about them when we look again and reflect upon what they were required, what was required of these young men in order to be brought back to be held there in Babylon, because it says that they were to have no blemish, they were to be well favored, they were supposed to be skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, understanding science, and have the ability to stand in the king's palace. And so they were kind of the cream of the crop of these young men. And so again, when we think about this, the king wanted the cream of the crop so that he could influence the other Hebrews. They would take these young men and teach them the Chaldean language and the ways of the Chaldean people. And then they would try to use them to influence the other Hebrews. That was the ideal, anyway, behind what they were doing. Now, if you look at verse 8 down through verse 13, it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. And so Daniel did not want to defile himself with the food that the king had set aside for the nourishment of these young men. And I'm sure that you and I would have probably thought that this food would have been great. It would have been pleasurable because, again, it was the best food in the kingdom. It was the king's food, straight from his table, as we saw there in verse 5. But the king would have had for one thing, a couple of motives in doing this, because we would wonder, well, why would the king go to all the trouble of feeding them so well? And again, the reason is, for one thing, it would be used kind of like a bribe in a sense to cause the young men to love the Chaldean way. I mean, if they're eating the best and getting the best treatment and so forth, it would just naturally cause them to, hey, things are going great, so why not just be a part of this thing? And so it would push them in that direction and help the cause of the king. And so it would help them in kind of brainwashing them, so to speak, into what they were wanting them to be. Secondly, it would keep up the good appearance of the young men and, again, have the same kind of effect. But Daniel purposes in his heart not to be defiled with the food. And this food would have probably defiled Daniel in at least 2 ways. Some of the food would have probably been things considered unclean for the Hebrews to eat under the Old Testament dietary laws. Secondly, the food was more than likely had been offered to idols and blessed in the name of an idol and things of that sort. And so those were probably some of the reasons that Daniel was saying, I don't want to defile myself with this. And so you notice in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 9 that God had brought Daniel into favor. He had brought him into favor with the prince of the eunuchs, just as God brought Joseph into favor with a prison guard and then with Pharaoh over Egypt. And We can see from this how that God takes care of His people. God has the ability to influence others on our behalf and to watch over us and make sure that we're taken care of when we need taken care of. And so, again, we see the sovereign hand of God there. Now, in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 12, Daniel suggests a trial basis of 10 days. He says, look, you feed us this vegetarian diet, is basically what he was asking for, and water. And he says, give us 10 days and then just simply compare us to these other men that you've been feeding from the king's food. And if you see that we're better, then just let us eat what we're requesting. And so if you look at verse 14 through verse 16, it says, so he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and finer in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine, and they should drink, and gave them pulse. And so he consented to Daniel's request, and as God blessed in 10 days, they came out looking better. They came out looking better than the others. In verse 17, it says, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And so, again, we see God at work here. God had a plan for these men. Therefore, God blessed them with everything they needed for God's plan. In verse 18, it says, now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even into the first year of King Cyrus. And so at the end of the 3 years, all these young men that had been carried away captive were brought in to stand before the king. And among all those taken, there was none to compare to Daniel and his companions. They were found to be 10 times wiser than all the magicians and astrologers of the land. And as is noted at the conclusion of the chapter, in verse 21, Daniel continued to be blessed of God with great influence even to the first year of King Cyrus. Now, the first year of King Cyrus would have been around 538 BC. And Cyrus is well known for allowing the Jews the liberty of returning to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple in the book of Ezra. Daniel continuing into the first year of King Cyrus doesn't mean to imply that Daniel died at that point or anything of that nature. We know that can't be the meaning because we read of Daniel being alive in the 3rd year of his reign. In Daniel chapter 10 and verse 1, you can see an example of that. But the object of Daniel 1:21 is to show us that Daniel had occupied a station of great influence from the beginning of the captivity until the order was given by King Cyrus of the Jews to rebuild the temple. And so Daniel lived through the 70-year Babylonian captivity of Israel, but he does not seem to have returned into Judea. He appears to have continued in the courts of the kings of the Medes and Persians to, I think, take care of the affairs of his people. Now, as we look at chapter 2, we'll get just a little bit into chapter 2 here. And if you look at verse 1 through 4, it says, and in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show thee interpretation. And so here we note that Nebuchadnezzar appears to be having a reoccurring dream. It's a reoccurring dream that's troubling him. Now, the reason I say that it's a reoccurring dream is because you notice in verse 1 and 2, it's referred to as dreams, plural, as in more than one. However, in verse 3, it's referred to in the singular form. And when we see Daniel later on interpreting it, he interprets it as one dream. And so I believe the reason that it was referred to in the plural form is because it was more than one dream, but it was the same dream. He kept having it. So he would have it, and then he would have the same dream again, and the same dream again, and that's what made it plural. And so the king calls together the magicians, astrologers, the sorcerers of the Chaldeans to show him his dream. And you pay particular attention to the statement in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 2 where he specifically states, for to show the king his dreams. That was his request. That was what he wanted. He called for all of them to show the king his dreams. Not to show the king the interpretation alone, but to show him the dreams. And I think it's important to realize that because in verse 4, the Chaldeans are basically saying, okay, here we are. You tell us the dream, and we'll tell you what it means. Well, any of us could do that, right? I mean, you could tell me a dream, and I could tell you what it meant. Might not be what it really meant, but I could tell you something. And if you had enough confidence in me, you'd just believe what I said. And if I was big enough of a con man, I would tell you what I knew would make you happy. And that way, you would really like me. And you would think, hey, I like this guy. He not only interprets dreams, but good things happen. And so that's the ideal of what's happening here. And so in verse 4, they're saying, okay, king, you tell us your dream, and we'll tell you what it means. Well, if you look in verse 5, it says, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. In other words, he said, I've already said it. If ye will not make known unto me the dream, that was his original request, you remember, was show me my dreams. With the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. But if you show the dream and the interpretation thereof, ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. And so you can see this thing's getting real serious real quickly. And it goes on and says, they answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it. The king answered and said, I know of a certainty that you would gain the time, because you see the thing is gone from me. But if you will not make known unto me the dream, there's but one decree for you. For ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation thereof. Now, most people understand the words of verse 5, I think, in the wrong way. They misunderstand it altogether. The misunderstanding comes from the statement, this thing is gone from me. Most people assume that the thing that had gone from him was his dream, as if he couldn't remember it, like he didn't know what it was. And therefore he needed them to tell him what the dream was. I personally believe that's the wrong assumption. I believe the thing spoken of in verse 5 and verse 8 was the command that we mentioned earlier that originally went forth from him. He's saying, I already said it. And what I said was, tell me my dream and the interpretation, then I'll know that you're telling me the truth. But that was his original request that went from him, was tell me the dreams. He sent for them to tell him the dreams. And so that's what he's saying. And so I believe the thing that went from him was those words that he spoke in saying, tell me my dreams. That was what he decreed. And so the king is saying in verse 7 that he knows they're wasting time because of the command that had gone out from the king's mouth. And I believe the other verses back that thought up, because the king is clearly stating his reasoning for the command. He's not saying, tell me my dream because I forgot what it was. He's saying, tell me my dream so I know you're not a con artist. And so he was, again, being really wise in his request. He knows that anybody can dish out a mouthful of, lies and make up whatever they think you want your dream to mean. And so the king came to a logical conclusion. If you have the power to tell me what my dream was, then you probably have the power to tell me the meaning of it, and I can trust what you're telling me the meaning is if you can actually tell me what the dream is. And so you notice how serious the king is about it, as he states that he'll have them cut into pieces. Now, in verse 10 through 13, it says, the Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there's not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, Lord, nor ruler that asked such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. And it is a rare thing that the king requireth, and there's none other that can show it before the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this cause the king was angry and very furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. And so they were seeking them as well. And so the Chaldeans knew they could not manage to do such a thing for the king, and therefore they try to persuade the king to change his mind. But he will not change his mind, and you can see that he is going to hunt them each and every one down, because he has became angry at this, feeling like that obviously these men were cons in what they had been doing, because if they couldn't tell him his dream, then he felt like anything they had been saying must have been totally bogus. And he was now seeing and realizing, hey, these people must be a fraud. And so he was going to have them all executed. And he's including Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in this, because they were considered some of those wise men there. And so we're going to leave off at this point, but Lord willing, next Wednesday, we'll pick back up, and we'll see, of course, that Daniel steps forward and requests a little bit of time to meditate and talk to the Lord. And the Lord reveals to Daniel the dream and the interpretation, and God gives him that ability, and Daniel gives God all the credit for that. But we'll find as we look at that interpretation that it shows us all of the world ruling empires, and it shows the ones that are now already past all the way into the future. And so God revealed through Daniel the prophet all of the world ruling empires. And to me, what's awesome about it is when it was revealed to Daniel, these things hadn't came to pass yet, but they began to come to pass and have continued to come to pass. And that's just another amazing thing that shows us just how awesome God's Word is, and that it prophesies these things and they take place. Because you can take the book of Daniel, you can look, and people don't really argue about when it was written. And so it's a historical fact. And so you can look at that, and then you can look at history and see when these world ruling empires came to pass, the ones that have already came to pass, and you can see that it was right on the money the way God was laying it out through the prophet Daniel. And so we think of how awesome that is and how amazing that it is. But we'll leave you with that thought and just continue to pray for all those that we have upon the prayer list, that the Lord would be with each one. And we pray that God would bless each of you. And do remember Sister Sandra as she travels back this way. And we just pray that God would bring us all back at His next appointed time and use it all to His praise and glory and honor. And we'll ask Brother Kenneth, if you would, to dismiss us in a word of prayer.